Hey guys, tonight we begin with a topic the ancient Egyptians took very seriously, and sometimes very weirdly: sex. From sacred rituals to surprisingly frank poetry, this civilization was more open, creative, and frankly experimental than most people today might be after 2 glasses of wine and a horoscope reading. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Egyptians didn't treat sex like a scandal. They treated it like plumbing: necessary, functional, and ideally without too many blockages. In ancient Egyptian society, sex wasn't hidden behind closed doors, hushed whispers, or uncomfortable euphemisms. It was part of nature, like the sun rising, the Nile flooding, or cats doing whatever they wanted. The gods did it. The farmers did it. The nobles did it. And crucially, no one felt the need to invent shame about it. The culture didn't frame sexuality as something dirty or dangerous. In fact, it was sacred, tied to creation, fertility, health, and personal pleasure. Not necessarily in that order. This wasn't hedonism. It was balance. Egyptian society ran on the principle of ma'at, cosmic harmony, and sexuality was part of maintaining that harmony. Fertility meant crops. Crops meant food. Food meant survival. So if your sex life was healthy, the gods were probably smiling. If not, well, maybe it was time to light a candle to Hathor and consider using more honey. This open attitude filtered into everything: art, literature, medicine, even architecture. Temples featured carvings of fertility gods. Homes were often built with private areas for intimacy. And yes, ancient architects had enough tact to know that love doesn't flourish next to granaries. And unlike many later societies, ancient Egypt didn't obsess over celibacy or punish people for having sex, unless it involved property disputes or someone else's wife. There were no mass puritanical movements, no complex hierarchies based on who did or didn't do what with whom. Your social value wasn't chained to what you did in bed. It was tied more to how much land you had, how good your grain harvest was, and whether you kept your linen white in the sun. If you're wondering why sex was treated with such casual sacredness in ancient Egypt, you can thank the gods, who, frankly, set the tone by making it part of their divine job descriptions. Let's begin with Atum, the original solo act. According to the Heliopolitan creation myth, Atum created the world by engaging in an act of, let's say, enthusiastic self-involvement. No partner, no help, just pure determination and cosmic alone time. From this, he produced Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture, which means the Egyptian universe literally began with a one-god show and bodily fluids. This wasn't scandalous. It was revered. Atum's generative act was seen as power, a divine assertion that life starts with desire. No need for fig leaves or awkward silence. The gods didn't blush. Why should anyone else? Next up, Osiris and Isis, ancient Egypt's royal couple. When Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set, Isis, determined and very committed, reassembled his body. All of it. Well, almost all. One crucial part was missing. So what did she do? She crafted a substitute phallus, yes, with magic, revived him long enough to conceive Horus, and voila, the divine bloodline continued. That's love. And excellent time management. Then there's Min, the god of fertility and male potency. He was often depicted standing tall, in every sense, crowned with lettuce, holding his most recognizable feature proudly in hand. Ancient statues didn't leave much to the imagination. Shrines to Min featured ritual lettuce offerings, symbolizing fertility. And, well, lettuce was kind of their Viagra. Hathor, goddess of love, music, and drunken joy, was another sensual figure. Often nude or semi-nude in depictions, she represented everything pleasurable about human connection: dancing, desire, laughter, and seduction. Festivals in her honor were essentially ancient tinder with tambourines. Even the sun god Ra had moments of reproductive importance, though usually involving creation through speech or spitting, which is only slightly less weird than Atum's solo performance. The gods modelled sexuality as divine, necessary, and sometimes a little experimental. They didn't separate the sacred from the sensual. They merged them. Not every Egyptian was crafting magical phalluses or offering sacred lettuce to the god of fertility. Most were just normal people with normal relationships, trying to find time for intimacy between feeding the livestock and avoiding crocodiles. Unlike their more dramatic gods and occasionally incestuous royalty, the average Egyptian's love life was pretty down to earth. If you were a farmer, a potter, or a linen worker, chances are your romantic endeavours revolved around who lived nearby, who made good beer, and who still had all their teeth by age 30. Standards, but reasonable. Relationships were built on shared labour, shared meals, and ideally, shared affection. Couples slept in the same bed, raised children together, and even snuck the occasional love note onto a potsherd. Yes, literal shards of pottery with messages like, "I dream of your beauty by night." That's ancient texting, folks. Sex wasn't regulated by priests or political decrees. As long as it was consensual and not interfering with your work or someone else's marriage contract, it was your business. Privacy might have been limited, walls were thin, and nosy neighbours were eternal, but intimacy was respected. For many couples, physical affection wasn't hidden. Tomb paintings sometimes showed husbands and wives touching tenderly, holding hands, or standing face to face, and not in the "this is purely ceremonial" kind of way. These were people who genuinely valued connection. The Egyptians also understood timing. Fertility mattered, a lot. The Nile flooded predictably, crops had seasons, and so did the human body. Women knew their cycles, men had herbal tonics, and everyone had at least one grandmother with unsolicited advice involving honey and onions. Contraception, while not foolproof, was part of life. So was midwifery. There were even pregnancy tests involving barley and emmer seeds. If they sprouted after being peed on, congratulations. If not, maybe next year. And if things didn't work out romantically, divorce was possible. No trials, no public shaming. Just a split of property and a return to separate bread ovens. If you're imagining ancient Egyptian weddings with veils, bouquets, and uncomfortable uncles doing the crocodile dance, you might want to scale it back. A lot. The truth is, in ancient Egypt, getting married was delightfully low effort. All you needed was a house, some bread, and mutual tolerance. A shared bed didn't hurt either. There was no ceremony, no priest, no registry office, no 47-plate catering menu, with chicken, lamb, or divine mystery stew. If two people agreed to live together and shared resources, food, linens, maybe a goat, society accepted them as married. Just like that. Done. No wedding dresses either. Women wore the same linen garments they wore every other day, usually white, sometimes pleated, always breathable. No rings, no vows, no emotional groomsmen with speech scrolls. Ancient Egyptian relationships didn't need pageantry. They needed practicality. You've got chores to do after all. The barley's not going to thresh itself. That said, couples did sometimes write up marriage contracts, especially in later periods. These were basically ancient prenups. Who brings what into the household? Who keeps what if things go sideways? Occasionally, the contracts even spelled out penalties for bad behaviour. If you hit me, you owe me silver. Not quite romantic, but very efficient. The marriage contracts also reinforced women's rights, something ancient Egypt was surprisingly advanced about. Women could own property, initiate divorce, and take ex-husbands to court if they tried anything funny. If love was blind, Egyptian law most definitely wasn't. There wasn't a honeymoon per se, unless you count collapsing after a big feast and hoping no neighbours overheard the fun. But intimacy, affection, and companionship were clearly valued. Marriage wasn't just a transaction, it was a partnership. Ideally. Let's get this out of the way. Ancient Egyptians valued fidelity, especially in theory. In practice, things were a little more flexible, particularly if you were wealthy, powerful, or had very convincing excuses. Adultery, like many social sins, wasn't always a criminal offense. For everyday folks, it was more of a reputational hazard than a legal disaster. If you got caught cheating, people would talk. Loudly. And probably in verse. But unless someone's livestock or inheritance was directly affected, the government wasn't rushing in to punish your escapades. However, if you were a married woman caught in adultery, the consequences could be harsher, socially and economically, if not legally. Egyptian society was patriarchal, but not aggressively so, and a woman's fidelity was often tied to questions of paternity, inheritance, and her general standing as someone who didn't cause chaos during harvest season. Accusations of infidelity could lead to divorce, public shame, and in rare cases, punishment like beatings or banishment, particularly in elite households where family honor was a full-time job. Men, meanwhile, had more wiggle room. A married man sleeping with an unmarried woman? Mostly shrugged off. A married man with another married woman? Now that was messy, especially if the other husband was important and not into sharing. Jealousy has never been confined to any one century. Texts from the New Kingdom mention moral expectations and the importance of a good reputation. In some stories, adulterers are described as foolish or dishonorable, while others suggest that a man who sleeps with another man's wife will have a tragic fate, usually involving curses, impotence, or angry gods with jackal heads. Still, the absence of strict laws against adultery in most periods is telling. The Egyptians didn't feel the need to legislate every affair. They relied more on shame, gossip, and the occasional passive-aggressive song lyric. It worked about as well as you'd expect. If a marriage broke down due to infidelity, the divorce process wasn't overly complicated. Property would be split, and the community would collectively pretend they weren't watching with interest. Children typically stayed with the mother, especially if they were young. If your first reaction to hearing that Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters is a horrified, "Wait, what?" You're not alone. Most modern humans respond the same way. But in ancient Egypt, sibling marriage among royalty wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Romantic? Not really. Political? Absolutely. To understand this eyebrow-raising tradition, you have to think like a pharaoh. Imagine you believe your family is descended from gods, and not in a metaphorical divine right way, but literally. If the gods married their siblings to maintain cosmic order, then obviously the royal family should do the same. Because nothing says eternal stability like awkward family reunions that double as wedding receptions. This wasn't about attraction. It was about power consolidation. Pharaohs didn't want outsiders, even noble ones, gaining access to the throne. Marrying a sister or half-sister kept the bloodline pure and the assets in-house. Essentially, royal Egypt ran on a combination of divine mythology and dynastic trust issues. Some of the most famous pharaohs followed this tradition. Tutankhamun, for example, was born from a brother-sister union, a fact confirmed by modern DNA analysis. And spoiler alert, it didn't turn out great. Tut had numerous congenital issues, including a clubfoot and a fragile immune system, which might suggest that repeating the family tree too many times comes with consequences. Meanwhile, commoners were not partaking in this trend. Most regular Egyptians married outside their immediate families like sane, functioning people. Cousin marriage occasionally happened in rural areas, but brother-sister unions were strictly for the folks with gold masks and burial boats. Even among royals, the practice could cause problems. When Cleopatra, yes, that Cleopatra, took the throne, she technically married her brothers, plural, as per custom, but she ruled largely alone and later aligned herself with men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, who were not, thankfully, related to her. To us, the whole concept seems bizarre, and yes, medically unwise. But to the ancient Egyptian elite, it was simply tradition wrapped in God-complex logic. Divine bloodlines had to stay divine, even if it meant sacrificing variety in the royal gene pool. If you assume all ancient Egyptian art was solemn statues, stiff postures, and endless profile views, you're technically right, unless you've seen the Turin erotic papyrus. Then you realise, oh, they had jokes and very detailed anatomy. While Egyptian art is mostly known for its restraint, stoic pharaohs, serene gods, perfectly symmetrical profile faces, the culture wasn't immune to cheekiness. Sex, after all, wasn't taboo. So occasionally, the artist stopped carving falcons and started sketching something a bit more animated. The most infamous example is that Turin papyrus, now tucked away in an Italian museum like a naughty secret. It's believed to date to around 1150 BCE, and it contains explicit scenes, not vague mythological winks. We're talking graphic illustrations of men and women, including one gentleman balancing acrobatically on amphorae, which is either symbolic or just showing off. Scholars debate whether it was satire, erotica, or a combination of both. Some think it was made to entertain, possibly even a bachelor's gift for someone with questionable taste. Others suggest it was a parody, an artistic prank poking fun at how obsessed people were with fertility, virility, and large wigs. Aside from this outlier, most Egyptian erotic art was symbolic, not explicit. Temples didn't have Kama Sutra frescoes. They had fertility motifs, sacred imagery, and occasional nudes representing rebirth, creation, or divine femininity. Goddesses like Hathor and fertility deities like Min were often shown nude, but in a reverent way. Min, for instance, is always depicted standing tall, if you catch the drift, holding his signature symbol like a divine badge of honor. Then there's the use of humor and sexuality in marginal drawings. Animals behaving like people, exaggerated gestures, and flirty little side sketches on workers' ostraca, limestone flakes used like sticky notes. The ancient equivalent of doodling in your notebook when the foreman wasn't looking. Eroticism in Egyptian art wasn't meant to scandalize. It was simply another part of life, occasionally celebrated, often ritualized, and sometimes hilariously over the top. These weren't repressed people. They just had an excellent sense of boundaries, and occasionally a day where they decided the scroll needed spice. If your idea of ancient love poetry is stiff, chiseled metaphors like, "Your beauty is like a grain silo," think again. The Egyptians may have carved hieroglyphs into stone, but their romantic writing was anything but rigid. These people knew how to flirt, with ink, with style, and occasionally with absolutely no chill. Preserved on papyri and broken pottery shards, because nothing says eternal love like a reused cereal bowl, Egyptian love poems date mostly to the New Kingdom period, around 1300 BCE. And they are refreshingly honest, surprisingly passionate, and occasionally so steamy you'd think they were written during a Nile flood with nothing better to do. Here's a genuine line from one. "I shall lie down at home and pretend to be sick. Then you will come and see me, and if you come near me, I will get better." This isn't vague romanticism. This is flirtation with a plan. Both men and women composed these poems, often from a first-person perspective. That's rare for the ancient world. In Egypt, a young woman could describe the thrill of sneaking glances across the lotus pond. A young man could wax poetic about how her voice was better than beer. That's the kind of devotion that deserves a monument. These weren't private diary entries either. Some of them were performed at banquets, read aloud for entertainment, courtship, or just to fill awkward silences between harp solos. Imagine ancient Tinder dates with live readings of passionate stanzas, followed by wine and maybe a goat roast. And the metaphors. Oh, they went all in. Fruit symbolized sensuality. Hunting meant pursuit and seduction. Gardens and rivers were, well, not always about agriculture. These poems weren't afraid to mix earthy, grounded affection with cosmic-level adoration. Desire wasn't something to be repressed. It was to be sung about, written down, and possibly recited by that one cousin who always read too slowly. When you think of aphrodisiacs, you probably imagine oysters, chocolate, or wine, not salad. But in ancient Egypt, if someone brought you a bouquet of lettuce, they weren't thinking about fiber. They were flirting. Specifically, they were invoking the power of Min, the Egyptian god of fertility, who, for reasons that are equal parts symbolic and suspicious, was closely associated with romaine lettuce. Yes, romaine. Not just your average Caesar garnish. This stuff was sacred. The reason? Well, unlike the floppy-leafed varieties we toss in sad lunch bowls today, Egyptian lettuce stood upright and oozed a milky white sap when cut. And if that didn't trigger some highly suggestive divine symbolism, nothing would. Ancient priests looked at that and thought, now that is clearly the embodiment of male potency. Naturally. Lettuce was regularly offered to Min during fertility rituals. His statues typically featured him in a, let's say, alert state, holding his signature attribute in one hand and a lettuce stalk in the other. Art historians have had a field day with that pairing for centuries. At fertility festivals, worshippers would present bundles of lettuce at his temple, hoping to gain his favour for increased virility, a healthy pregnancy, or just a bit of romantic luck. Min was basically the ancient Egyptian version of a dating app algorithm. Worship him correctly, and your chances might improve. Interestingly, there's evidence that the lettuce was also believed to have medicinal properties, particularly for promoting sexual health. Whether it actually worked or just led to fresher breath before a date is debatable, but the symbolism stuck. And this wasn't just a passing trend. Lettuce appears in art, hieroglyphics, and even offerings in tombs, as if to say, please ensure I continue enjoying pleasure in the afterlife, and maybe pack a salad. It's worth noting that the ancient Egyptians were big fans of natural symbolism. From the Nile's life-giving floods to the lotus flower's daily blooming cycle, the physical world mirrored their spiritual beliefs. So when a vegetable starts acting a little extra, you best believe it got promoted to mystical status. When it came to preventing pregnancy, the ancient Egyptians employed methods that were imaginative, herbal, and occasionally alarming. Without access to modern science, they relied on natural substances, accumulated wisdom, and texts like the Ebers Papyrus, one of the earliest surviving medical documents, dating to around 1550 BCE. One of the more infamous prescriptions involved crocodile dung. Mixed with honey and sourdough, this concoction was inserted vaginally as a form of barrier contraceptive. While modern readers may recoil, the idea was not entirely without logic. The mixture likely created an acidic or obstructive environment. Whether it was effective is unclear. Whether it was unpleasant is easier to guess. More promising was the use of acacia gum, a plant extract that, as later science confirmed, ferments into lactic acid, a compound that does in fact have spermicidal qualities. Combined with other ingredients like honey and dates, it formed a kind of early pessary. It's one of the few ancient remedies that could arguably pass a very lenient clinical trial. These methods suggest that Egyptian women, who had notable legal and medical agency for the time, took active roles in managing reproduction. The use of these materials would have been common knowledge among midwives, healers, and women within the household. There were also ritual and spiritual approaches. Women might appeal to fertility deities like Isis, Hathor, or Bez, seeking either conception or its delay. Magical amulets and incantations were used alongside practical remedies, blurring the line between medicine and religion, as was typical in most aspects of Egyptian life. In addition to preventing pregnancy, Egyptian medical texts contain instructions for inducing menstruation, treating infertility, and even early pregnancy detection using barley and emmer grains exposed to urine, a method surprisingly accurate in some cases. In the absence of modern tools, these practices reveal a culture deeply invested in understanding and influencing the human body. They lacked microscopes, but not intention. Fertility was a matter of life, death, economics, and divine favour. And while some of their methods may now seem outlandish, the impulse behind them, to plan, to protect, to prepare, is strikingly familiar. In ancient Egypt, virginity wasn't a badge of honor, a social currency, or a fragile family heirloom to be guarded at all costs. In fact, it wasn't really a big deal at all, more like a passing footnote in the grander narrative of life, which mostly revolved around crops, inheritance, and not angering the gods before breakfast. There's no known Egyptian word for virgin in the moralistic, ceremonial sense. The closest you'll find are terms that mean young woman, or uninitiated, which is less purity culture, and more hasn't had the time yet. No torches were lit, no ceremonies performed, and no mothers-in-law inspecting linens like they were looking for counterfeit currency. This wasn't because the Egyptians were scandalous libertines. It's just that they had a far more functional approach to sex. It was seen as part of life, like eating bread or avoiding hippos. Important, yes. Sacred sometimes. But nothing that required a purity certificate stamped by a temple priest. For women, value came from things like fertility, loyalty, and whether she could run a household without the roof catching fire. Her sexual history? Mostly her business. Marriage wasn't about sealing a chaste deal. It was about forming a reliable alliance that could ideally survive tax season and plagues. Of course, modesty existed. People didn't walk around advertising their conquests on papyrus scrolls, but the kind of ritual obsession with virginity found in later societies just didn't materialize here. No cloistering, no dowries based on moral performance, no uncles making awkward speeches about virtue. Even Egyptian religion offered little support for the whole purity panic. The goddess Hathor, patron of love, music, and wine, was openly sensual and extremely unbothered by anyone's opinions. The gods were far too busy managing creation and cosmic balance to weigh in on who had done what, when, and with whom. In the end, virginity in ancient Egypt was treated for what it is, a temporary condition, not a lifelong resume. And frankly, they seemed more concerned with who could bake good bread and whether your father had a reliable roof to offer. Because when you live in a desert surrounded by crocodiles, you learn pretty quickly what really matters, and what absolutely doesn't. Ancient Egyptian society didn't publish rainbow flags or hold parades, but it also didn't seem particularly troubled by the existence of same-sex relationships. There were no official laws condemning them, no public stonings, and, most tellingly, no frenzied temple sermons about the end of civilization brought on by two men sharing a bedroll. In short, they noticed, but didn't panic. The most discussed example is that of Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep, two high-ranking officials buried together in a shared tomb at Saqqara. Their tomb features intimate artwork, the pair embracing, touching noses, a gesture equivalent to a kiss, and generally behaving like a couple whose biggest argument was probably about linen colours. The inscriptions refer to them as overseers of the manicurists, which sounds innocuous until you realise they were clearly close enough to be buried as one household unit. Were they lovers? Roommates with exceptional boundaries? Brothers unusually fond of holding hands? Scholars still debate, but the visual language leans heavily in favour of a romantic, or at least deeply affectionate bond. And the fact that their tomb exists, beautifully decorated, publicly visible, suggests that nobody was outraged. They were important, respected, and apparently allowed to be themselves, even in death. Egyptian texts and mythology also leave space for fluidity. Some deities, like Hapi, god of the Nile, are depicted as intersex or androgynous. Others take on dual roles or switch genders in mythological tales without causing divine HR complaints. The gods, it seems, were not limited by human categories, and neither were the people invoking them. That said, there's no evidence of organised same-sex marriages or political recognition of same-gender unions. Egyptians were pragmatic. If a relationship produced heirs and property stability, great. If it didn't, well, that was your household's business. Intimacy, as always, was treated with a curious mix of privacy and normalcy. And while male same-sex relations are more visible in the records, female ones are almost completely absent, not because they didn't happen, but because Egyptian scribes had a frustrating habit of ignoring what women did when no men were around. In ancient Egypt, having children wasn't just desirable. It was a social expectation, a spiritual duty, and, if you were lucky, a way to ensure someone would refill your tomb offerings long after you were gone. So when a couple struggled to conceive, it wasn't brushed aside. It was investigated, medically, magically, and sometimes both in the same afternoon. The ancient Egyptians approached infertility with characteristic pragmatism. Their medical papyri, particularly the Kahun gynecological papyrus, dating to around 1800 BCE, include detailed diagnoses, treatments, and methods for evaluating female fertility. There were instructions for examining cervical mucus, monitoring cycles, and even a primitive pregnancy test involving urinating on barley and emmer wheat. If the grains sprouted, congratulations, your household was about to get louder. If not, the next step might involve inserting herbal mixtures, fumigating the womb, yes really, or appealing to higher powers. Because in Egypt, if medicine didn't work, magic was always available, and often recommended. Amulets played a central role. Symbols of Hathor, Isis, Bez, or Taweret, the hippo-shaped protector of childbirth, were worn, carried, or placed under pillows. Spells were recited. Figurines were buried or cradled. One text suggests that to conceive, a woman should drink a concoction of ground dates, honey, and carob while reciting a protective charm. Not FDA approved, but deeply heartfelt. Men, of course, weren't off the hook, though far fewer papyri bother to question their reproductive contributions. In cases of persistent infertility, a man might be told to undergo purification rituals, consult a priest, or, in less official advice, simply try harder. And because this was Egypt, cosmic order, Ma'at, was always part of the equation. A childless couple might be seen as unbalanced, or even cursed, but society didn't shun them. It offered remedies, hope, and a few very creative prescriptions. It's worth noting that despite all this effort, Egyptian households weren't necessarily overflowing with children. High infant mortality, disease, and malnutrition kept family sizes smaller than ideal, which only made fertility all the more sacred, and its absence all the more personal. If you think desire fades after death, the ancient Egyptians would like a word, and possibly a carefully carved offering slab. In their worldview, death wasn't an end. It was a continuation of life, ideally with all the comforts, pleasures, and daily routines of the living world, including sex. Funerary texts, tomb inscriptions, and grave goods all suggest that the deceased hope to carry their appetites into the afterlife, not just for bread and beer, but for love, touch, and intimacy. Because frankly, what's the point of eternal life if it doesn't include a bit of pleasure? Tomb art often depicted couples embracing, holding hands, or standing intimately close, not just for sentiment, but as a spiritual blueprint. These weren't generic stock poses, they were deliberate messages to the gods. Please restore our bodies, our love, and, if possible, our bedroom privileges. And yes, bodily restoration was a serious concern. In the Book of the Dead and other mortuary texts, the dead are promised their limbs will function, their hearts will be weighed fairly, and their, let's say, equipment will be returned intact. There are even references to revivifying certain parts of the anatomy. No detail was considered too personal for eternity. Sexuality was tied to rebirth. The god Osiris, famously dismembered and reassembled by Isis, was revived, including a reconstructed phallus, before fathering Horus. This myth wasn't just legend, it was a template. If the gods resumed intimacy after resurrection, so should the rest of us. Some tomb inscriptions even included requests to the gods for continued love between husband and wife. in the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of paradise. It was envisioned as a lush, idealized version of earthly life. Fertile land, calm waters, eternal abundance, and, evidently, room for romance. While modern cultures often compartmentalize sex as earthly and mortal, the Egyptians folded it seamlessly into their afterlife ideology. It wasn't shameful or forgotten. It was another part of the soul's well-being, like food, music, and not having to pay taxes ever again. In the end, they hoped for what most people still do: comfort, companionship, and a little joy, even if it took mummification and a few magical scrolls to get there. When we peel back the linen wrappings of ancient Egypt, metaphorically of course, what we find is a civilization that didn't treat the human body as something shameful, sinful, or suspicious. It was seen as natural, powerful, and capable of both divine creation and very human desire. Sex, for the Egyptians, was not a secret to be hidden. It was a fact of life, discussed in poems, depicted in art, sometimes vividly, and written into the very myths that shaped their worldview. Gods themselves fell in love, flirted, seduced, and occasionally caused fertility-related chaos across the Nile. In a culture where existence flowed from cycles, the flooding of the river, the return of the sun, the rebirth of the soul, sexuality was part of that rhythm, not an interruption of it. They also took a practical approach. From contraception and fertility treatments to love songs and afterlife desires, the Egyptians faced physicality head-on, often with more clarity than many societies that came centuries later. There was no hysterical legislation, no moral panic, no need for uncomfortable censorship scribbled in the margins of sacred texts. Just a clear understanding. Bodies do things, people feel things, and the world keeps turning. Importantly, they didn't overthink it. Sex wasn't put on a pedestal, nor was it dragged through the mud. It was part of health, love, family, and sometimes religion, worthy of respect, but not surrounded by neurosis. Even their gods, powerful and eternal, didn't shy away from physical form or intimacy. In fact, they embodied it. And while not every practice holds up today, we're looking at you, crocodile dung, the attitude remains refreshingly modern. Or perhaps modernity has just taken 3,000 years to catch up. And maybe that's the legacy worth remembering. A culture that didn't fear the body, didn't vilify desire, and somehow still managed to build pyramids on top of it all. It was August 24th, 1814, and Washington, D.C. was burning. Columns of smoke choked the night sky as British soldiers torched the most symbolic buildings in the young republic: the Capitol, the Treasury, the War Office, and the President's Mansion, later to be called the White House. Flames licked the rooftops as the redcoats walked through the city almost casually, facing no organized resistance. The Capitol, barely a teenager in political years, was defenseless. The humiliation was complete. The world watched in disbelief, and America blushed with shame. But to understand how things got this bad, you have to rewind a bit. 2 years earlier, the United States had declared war on Great Britain, filled with confidence and grand delusions. The Americans thought the war would be swift and glorious, that they'd invade Canada, defeat the British, and finally earn global respect. After all, Britain was already exhausted fighting Napoleon in Europe. Surely they wouldn't have the energy to bother with a scrappy ex-colony acting tough. They were wrong. Not only did the invasion of Canada fail miserably, but the US Navy's few successes couldn't make up for repeated land defeats. Political divisions inside America made matters worse. Some states didn't want the war at all. Supplies were short, strategy was confused, and worst of all, the British never forgot. By 1814, Napoleon was defeated, and Britain had a clear calendar. With veteran troops now available, they turned their full attention across the Atlantic. And they were ready to send a message, one that would sear itself into the American psyche for generations. Washington, D.C. wasn't just targeted for military reasons, it was symbolic, the seat of power, the pride of the Republic. And on that humid August day, it was left almost completely undefended, because no one really believed the British would dare strike it directly. The irony: they didn't just dare, they planned it down to the minute. What unfolded wasn't a battle, it was a torchlit parade of revenge, a reminder that the British Empire, despite the revolution, still had the power to humiliate its former colonies. And as the flames engulfed the House of Representatives and smoke blackened the dome of the Capitol, America had to ask itself a painful question. Had they underestimated the empire they once defied? The British didn't just appear in Washington by magic. Their road to the Capitol was shockingly easy, because the Americans practically opened the door for them. Their landing point was Benedict, Maryland, a sleepy town on the Patuxent River. From there, seasoned British Major General Robert Ross led roughly 4,500 troops, many of them veterans fresh from the Napoleonic Wars, on a march toward Washington. And it wasn't a desperate push through enemy territory. No, it was more like a Sunday hike. Why? Because the Americans barely tried to stop them. President James Madison and his government knew the British were coming. They had time. Warnings had come from scouts and even civilians. But bureaucracy, indecision, and just plain wishful thinking led to a sluggish and chaotic defense. Secretary of War John Armstrong Jr., in a moment of genius-level denial, insisted the British wouldn't dare attack Washington. "They'll go for Baltimore," he claimed, repeatedly. Spoiler, they didn't. Brigadier General William Winder was the man in charge of stopping the British advance. Unfortunately, Winder was better at writing reports than leading troops. His hastily assembled defence force consisted of militiamen, many untrained, undisciplined, and some reportedly drunk. The professional soldiers he had were too few. Worse, Winder hesitated. He kept pulling back instead of digging in, unsure where the British would strike. The two forces finally met on August 24th at the Battle of Bladensburg, just northeast of Washington. American forces outnumbered the British, but that didn't matter. The battle was a total fiasco. Militiamen broke ranks and fled before firing a shot. Some simply dropped their weapons and ran. President Madison himself was on the field briefly, then wisely decided to not die with the amateurs. The British, stunned by the ease of victory, pressed forward. No trenches to overcome, no burning barricades, no desperate defence of the capital. Just a straight shot into the city. It was a comedy of errors, but no one was laughing. By the time the British reached Washington, American leadership had dissolved into chaos. Madison fled. Government documents were being stuffed into carts. First Lady Dolly Madison, refusing to abandon the White House without dignity, packed up valuables, including Gilbert Stuart's now famous portrait of George Washington. As night fell, the Redcoats marched in, and the match was almost ready to be lit. By the time the British entered Washington, the city was nearly deserted. Politicians had fled. The streets were quiet, eerily so. The only sounds were the boots of British soldiers and the soft crackle of fires already smouldering from earlier skirmishes. Major General Robert Ross and Admiral George Cockburn led their men with clinical precision. No looting, no chaos, just a disciplined mission to make a statement. And what a statement it was. The British troops began with the Capitol building. It was still under construction, but the north and south wings, the chambers of Congress, were complete enough to symbolize the pride and function of the American government. The British set fire to both wings. Flames engulfed the Library of Congress. The books and manuscripts, some irreplaceable, went up in smoke. It wasn't just a military blow. It was a cultural one. Next, they moved to the White House, then known as the President's Mansion. Dolly Madison had already fled, but not before rescuing that now iconic portrait of George Washington. British troops found the building empty, but dinner was laid out on the table, untouched. In what might be history's most awkward meal, British officers sat down and enjoyed the president's dinner before torching the place. They were deliberate, almost ceremonial, in the destruction. Cockburn, who had a personal score to settle with the Americans for mocking him in political cartoons, reportedly made a point of burning the offices of anti-British newspapers, and even stood atop the Speaker's chair in the House of Representatives, declaring mockingly, "Shall this harbour of Yankee democracy be burned? Oh yes, it shall." Over the course of 2 days, building after building was put to the torch. The Treasury, the War Department, the Navy Yard, the Arsenal. Even the bridge across the Potomac was burned to prevent counterattacks. Yet despite the thoroughness, some sites were spared. The Patent Office, for instance, was saved because one brave American, William Thornton, convinced the British that it served all mankind, not just the US government. The destruction wasn't random. It was surgical, and it was meant to humiliate. The British weren't trying to conquer Washington. They were trying to shame it. And with each building that collapsed in flames, their message grew louder. This wasn't just a raid. It was a punishment, and the smoke would linger far beyond the ashes. Just as the British settled into their fiery conquest of Washington, something strange happened. The sky darkened. Winds picked up. Then came the thunder. A violent, freakish storm, what some later called a hurricane, slammed into the capital. It was as if nature herself had decided the city had suffered enough. Torrential rain poured down, extinguishing many of the fires the British had set. High winds tore roofs off buildings and even lifted cannons off the ground. A British soldier was reportedly crushed by flying debris. The storm grew so intense that British officers began to fear it was a divine judgment, a punishment for burning a defenceless city. And then, almost prophetically, a tornado ripped through the heart of DC. Yes, a literal tornado. It tore through the centre of town, flinging carts and debris like matchsticks. Buildings collapsed, trees snapped in half, and British soldiers were thrown to the ground, confused and shaken. The British command, already preparing to leave, took this as a clear sign. Their message had been delivered. To stay longer might be tempting fate. They pulled out of the city the next day, their mission complete and their boots barely dry. For Washington, the storm was both a curse and a blessing. On one hand, it caused even more destruction, ripping apart already damaged structures and flooding the streets. On the other hand, it helped extinguish the flames and may have prevented the complete destruction of the city. It quite literally washed away the British presence. In the minds of many Americans, this storm took on near mythical status. Clergy declared it an act of divine intervention. Editorials praised the hand of providence. Even hardened soldiers whispered that God had stepped in to protect the capital when man had failed to do so. Of course, nature doesn't take sides. The storm didn't rebuild the city or restore lost lives, but symbolically, it marked a turning point. The fires were out, the British were gone, and what remained, smoking ruins, wet ash, shattered pride, was still American. The storm became a strange kind of salvation. In the absence of military strength, Washington had been spared by something else, something uncontrollable, unpredictable, and perhaps, in its own way, redemptive. The worst was over, but rebuilding the soul of a nation? That was just beginning. The British had left, the fires were out, the storm had passed. But what they left behind wasn't just ash and rubble, it was psychological devastation. Washington, D.C. lay in ruin. The capital was a blackened shell.